started by the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare nearly 3 years ago. We when we started, we had in mind to bring in the best policy thinkers across the world, have a blend of Indian policymakers and from the rest laureates, Stanford, the other from Harvard. We have also had foreign scholars from across the planet come and speak to us under this webinar.
Karan, I have lost you.
And this is to do something with poverty.
I have lost you. I am losing you intermittently. Is something wrong with my end?
Audible?
You are
Dr.
audible
Vishwanath,
intermittently.
am I audible?
You are audible intermittently. Okay. I can't hear you.
1 minute. Vivek, can you hear me?
I can now hear you, yes.
Yes, you are audible now.
Let me introduce the speakers for the day. We have Professor Kundu, who is chairing this at WRI India. He was a distinguished fellow at RIS for developing countries. He was professor and dean of the School of Social Sciences at JNU, a member of National Statistical Commission, and chaired the post-Suture Evaluation Committee, and that for estimating urban housing shortage. He was regional advisor on poverty and consultant to Sri Lankan government on population census. Currently, he is chairing a committee to monitor the national survey being conducted for Swachh Bharat mission for the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. He was visiting professor at the University of Amsterdam and University of Würzburg. He was director at various institutes in India and is in the editorial board of a large number of national and international journals. He has about 25 books and 200 research articles published in India and abroad to his credit. Professor Kundu will be chairing the session today. The main speaker for the day is Shinya Kotera. I hope I've spelled it right. Shinya is an economist at the European Department of the IMF, where he is the economist for Slovakia. Previously, he was an economist in the IMF Regional Office for Asia and Pacific and worked with the Micronesia and India teams. Before joining the IMF, he worked as an economist at the Cabinet Office in Japan and private think tank where he analyzed economic, financial, and fiscal developments. His research interests include labor markets, inflation, and machine learning. He obtained his MS from the University of Edinburgh, the University of Warwick, and the University of Tokyo. Our discussion for the day is going to be Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who's a senior India analyst for the Observatory Group, a New York-based macroeconomic policy advisory firm. In 2017, he was appointed as member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He has been a member of the Secondary Markets Advisory Committee of SEBI and the National Statistical Commission of India. Dr. Bhalla is the former executive director of the IMF. He was also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council before he went to IMF as the executive director. Dr. Bhalla writes extensively on economic issues and has recently authored another book titled The New Wealth of Nations. Our other discussant for today is Karan, Bhasin, a young friend of mine. He is an Indian columnist, researcher, and regular TV presenter. He's worked with several think tanks and has been a vocal supporter of India's current government in its economic performance. He has also worked as a research assistant at EGROW Foundation. He attended Delhi's prestigious State Columbus School. He graduated with a bachelor's degree of economics honors from the University of London, and he obtained a master's degree in economics from Terry School of Advanced Studies. He has been working on this issue with Dr. Bhalla and has a celebrated paper on this very issue that is being discussed today. With this, Professor Kundu, I hand over the session to you.
Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh, Dr. Shinya Kotera, Professor Surjit Bhalla, Dr. Karan, Bhasin, colleagues and friends. It's honor and privilege for me to associate myself with this EGROW webinar on a very important topic, poverty, inequality, the impact of COVID-19. I don't know, being inducted as a discussant with 24 hours notice and then upgraded or downgraded from discussant to the chairperson, is it, I can't complain about that. Charan is a dear friend. And secondly, I understand that Surjit has an important mission. He would be traveling to Pakistan. I hope that would bring down the hot talk that goes on two sides, because I think Surjit would interact with important people on the other side. So let me start by complimenting EGROW Foundation and particularly Dr. Charan Singh for organizing, as far as I know, perhaps the seventh webinar on this very important topic of poverty and inequality. EGROW organizes workshops and seminars not only on fanciful topics of exports, growth, development, and our external relationship, where India is doing fabulously well, but also focuses on important areas of concern like poverty, inequality. And I'm very happy about that. And we have, as I said, I'm participating in the seventh webinar on this, and we're privileged to have Dr. Shinya Kotera presenting the IMF working paper done by him and his colleagues. Is a very important contribution, and I'm really pleased to associate myself. My initial reading told me that as if it's a confirmation of all that has come up so far, that poverty has declined significantly in India. Well, COVID-19 had some short-term impact. India has recovered from that, and the government policies and the programs have made a significant contribution in the poverty reduction. But when you look deep, and I'm sure we will all get those details from Dr. Kotera, that besides this confirmation of the general assessments that have come out from the different studies, he goes into the detail of relationship, the factors behind this poverty reduction. The household characteristics have been brought in as explanatory variables, has analyzed the relationship of employment, income growth, and the fluctuations from the first wave to the second wave. I'm really excited to get the details, and I'm sure all of us will enjoy. Let's have the presentation from Dr. Kotera, and then we will have two discussants, and we'll open the floor for everyone to comment and give their observations or make their critical observations, and go back richer in terms of our understanding of what happened during the COVID period because of the functioning of the labor market and also through the interventions of the government. Dr. Kotera, the time is yours. 25 minutes should be all right, but you can exceed it also, and we'll have all the other two-part discussions coming up following you. Dr. Bhalla is here. No, he has joined. Dr. Surjit Bhalla? Karan?
Sir, I think he has joined, but even if he has not joined, I'll request him to join now. He promised that he will join and give his observation. Yeah, he has joined, sir. He's
okay,
there.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Kotera, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just share my screen. You see the slide now?
Yes, visible.
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
Yes? Okay, then I can, is it good? All right, so I can start. So first of all, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to present our work, our IMF working paper. So as you kindly say, this is, the IMF working paper. We did it with coworker, and I'm here to represent this work. But it just please kindly know that this is the views expressed in these presentations or in these seminars, those of our authors, and not the IMF. So please kindly note that. And we can start from the presentations. So I'll start from the motivations of these studies. So as you kindly said, the India has made significant progress in reducing the poverty over the long run, as you can see from the left chart. So World Bank estimates suggest the poverty rate measured in the PPP $1.9 has declined from 40% within 2004, and it was just 20% in 2011, where the latest official household survey data is available. So given the lack of official data after 2011, so many researchers tried to find out what happened after that. So, and they all suggest, all existing study broadly suggests that the poverty rate has continued to decline since 2011. And although there seems to be uncertainty regarding the magnitude. And on the other hand, we see the inequality seems to have still slightly increased, or at least until 2011. Then it's come to the pandemic. So pandemic raised a concern about the inequality and poverty. As you can see from the left-hand chart, GDP as well as the private consumption per capita declined sharply during the first and second wave of the pandemic. And also the labor market impact was severe, and following the first wave of the pandemic, the employment to population ratio, which does the red dotted lines, decreased by 7.3% point, and unemployment rate, the black line, it spiked about 20% in urban areas. Although the although the GDP, both GDP data and labor market indicators recovered quickly after these first and second wave, the macro data, these are the macro data, so they might mask the distributional impact that the pandemic may have. So, and also to mitigate adverse impact caused by the pandemic, existing social assistance schemes has been expanded during this period. Food transfer provided by the public distribution systems were expanded 1.4% of GDP in FY20, which is a major component of additional spending, which is the green part of the left chart. And the direct cash transfer and the rural employment guarantee program were also expanded during this period and represented 0.3% of GDP and 0.4% of the GDP respectively. And in terms of coverage, the rural employment guarantee beneficiary during the pandemic picked about 4% of the population, as you can see up the right chart. So based on this background, our research trying to answer these three questions as I showing here. So the first, we studied the dynamics of incomes and consumption distributions. And then we investigate the evolutions of poverty and inequality in India during the pandemic. So what happened to poverty and inequality after the pandemic? The second question, we examined the key channels through which the pandemic impacted poverty using the regression analysis. And the third, and finally, we assess the potential impact of the government social assistance schemes during the pandemic to using the simulation exercises. So that's our three questions. So before going into the detail, we just quickly summarize our main key points. So first, the economic downturn associated with the pandemic is estimated to have at least temporarily increased the poverty and inequality in India. And second, regression estimates suggest that the characteristics such as like lower skills and informal employment are associated with higher probability of falling into the poverty, which implies that the importance of upgrading skills and as well as the promoting formalizations to mitigate the future possible shocks. And lastly, the policy simulation suggests that given the large adverse shock of the pandemic, supporting broader group of the household would be appropriate, at least initially, but effort to improve the targeting may need to continue towards the recovery to enhance the effectiveness of the fiscal expenditures. So, and our also research contribute to the multiple strands of the literatures. So first, we contribute to the literature on the pandemic, poverty by using the two national representative household survey, which I'm going to mention later, maybe next slide, during the pandemic. So we're using two data, micro data set, or was to conduct the robustness check over analysis. And also secondary, our analysis contributes to India's poverty and inequality literatures by providing insights into the changes and drivers during the pandemic, as we do not have official data after 2011. And third, our work to the debate on policy responses during the pandemic by providing the simulation exercises of social systems using the actual households data. So before going to answering the three questions I mentioned, I'm going to briefly discuss about the data. So we are mainly using the two households data sets, namely the Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, which is CPHS, and conducted by the private agency called CMI, and also the periodic labor force survey, so PLFS. It's a labor force survey. So we use two data sets. The benefits, so there's also, we believe there's also benefits and advantage and disadvantages for each data set to investigate our research. So the benefits of this CPHS is that it tracks the same household over time, over a relatively longer horizon, so which allow us to conduct the panel data analysis. And another benefits of this survey is that it is the only nationally representative survey during the pandemic, covering the household-related variable comprehensively, including like total incomes as well as the detailed data of consumptions. However, it's also important to note here the CPHS, the definitions of like consumptions and incomes. These definitions are different from the official data. So it is, so our goal here, our goal of research is to capture the changes in drivers and poverty and inequality during the pandemic, as opposed to estimate the level consistent with the official measures or surveys. And also, furthermore, the disadvantage of this CPHS is many papers, existing papers or researchers raise the concerns about the representativeness, like missing the lower income samples, and also the decline, the response rate declined during the pandemic. So to address these issues, or at least to mitigate as much as possible, we modify the household weight based on the National Family Health Survey in the two round 2015 as well as 2019 round, so that the weighted average is household characteristic. So such means like age, education, or asset ownership. Those characteristics should be broadly consistent with the official survey. So with weighted average, so all these weighted characteristics should be broadly the same with National Family Health Surveys. So another data set is the periodic labor force survey, PLFS. No need to mention it in details, but we just quickly say this is an advantage in terms of representativeness, and they have a rich labor market informations. And in urban areas only, they visit the same household for 4 times. So which also means we can do a panel data analysis, although it cannot go beyond 1 year. So, however, this is a labor force survey. So the coverage of our analysis for PLSS is limited to the end of the labor income. Okay, so then we can finally go to the first questions, which is what happened to poverty and inequality during the pandemic. So inequality analysis, our inequality analysis is based on 2 measures. So both incomes inequality and consumption inequality. So we divided the sample into quartiles based on per capita income by regions, so rural and urban, for every month of the quarter. And for each quartile, we calculated the average level of incomes or consumptions and rebased the year 2019 average as 100. Then the inequality is measured between the difference between the top, which is the fourth, and the bottom quartiles. We also assess the inequality based on the Gini coefficient, which is a very common measures for inequality. For poverty, we define the poverty line using the World Bank's 1.9 and as well as the $3.2 PPP daily consumption matrix. And we measure the poverty changes during the pandemic. So the chart here describes the result of income inequality using the different quartiles. So during the first wave of the pandemic, zones in the bottom quartiles reached almost 0 income, which is the blue line. However, the income reductions for those on the top quartiles was about 20%. You can see this one at the green dashed line. So as a result, income inequality spiked significantly during this period, which you see at the gray or the black line. So even though the inequality has almost returned to the pre-pandemic level by the end of 2021, the poverty of some inequality, the recovery of some quartiles lags with others, including the top quartiles in the urban areas and the bottom quartiles in rural areas. So the next slide here is the almost same exercises, but using labor income from the PLFS. And the charts suggest the broadly similar pictures before, but they clearly shows larger declines, distributional impact, so clearly showing larger distributional impact in the urban areas. So the difference between the top and the bottom quartile, as you see again at the gray line, reached about 90 in the second quarter of 2022 in urban areas, where this gray line was reached about 60 in rural areas. So the impact on urban areas was much bigger. And regarding the second wave, the clear decline was observed only for the bottom groups, And again, the larger the mass impact is observed in urban areas. So compared with income, the dynamics in inequality in terms of consumptions are much milder. In urban areas, the consumption decline of the bottom quartiles, the blue lines, is smaller than the decline in the other quantiles. And there is a significant, there is a slight improvement in during this period. As again, you can see this as the green or black line. In rural areas, all quartiles saw almost like similar declines across all quartiles. So there's almost no changes in inequality. And towards the end of 2021, the consumption recovery is slower for the top quartiles in rural areas, which implies some improvements in inequality. So this is the result for the Gini coefficient, and it also suggests very similar pictures. As shown in this left chart, Gini coefficient in terms of the income increased drastically during the second quarter of 2020, especially in urban areas. However, Gini coefficient declined back rapidly after this. And contrary to income, the Gini coefficient in terms of consumptions dropped actually during the second quarter of 2022. This is because that the top earners cut consumption at larger magnitude than the bottom earners. And although there's no drastic changes in inequality in terms of consumptions, the decline in consumption occurred across all percentiles. So this suggests that the lockdown period may have exacerbated the poverty situations. So this chart shows the index of populations living below the $1.2 and $3.2 PPP daily consumption by setting the 2019 calendar year average as 100. And although there seems to be an improvement of the poverty over time, it increased drastically during the lockdown period, reaching more than the 4 times of the 2019 average level based on the $1.9 lines. However, the situation improved towards the end of 2021, and as of at the end of 2021, the number of people under the poverty line was practically back to the pre-pandemic level. Okay, so that's our end of our first questions. And now we move to the second question, which is the channels of the impact. So to capture the characteristics affecting poverty, incomes, and consumption changes during the pandemic, we conducted 2 types of regression analysis using the household survey as the panel datasets. So the first regression analysis to investigate who has the greater chances of becoming poor after the pandemic. So for this analysis, we limit the sample who were not poor in 2019, but moved into the poverty after March 2020. And for this analysis, we will use the $3.2 poverty line for this exercise to better capture the characteristics that matter most. And the second regression analysis is to investigate the income and consumption changes, percent changes, before and after the pandemic shocks using the all available samples. So I can move to the result of the first regression analysis, and the chart here shows the estimated probability of falling below $3.2 poverty line after the pandemic, even though these people were never ever below the poverty line in 2019. This the probability here, the chart here, is estimated by setting the all variable at their respective average and except for the variable of interest. The very left bar suggests that a household with the youth and children, more like having many children or any youth, people are having a higher probability of falling into the poverty. And from the labor market perspective, we can see that the low skill people, like low education people, as well as unprotected employment status, such as the temporary waged or casual workers, seems to be the main drivers of falling into the poverty. And in terms of the industry-wide result, it's a bit unclear. However, we can see that household head employed at the other services seems to have a slightly higher chance of falling into the poverty lines. The other services jobs include the personal, non-professional services, which generally refer to a physical or like a manual type jobs. So like example include like a barbers or gardeners or decorators or like the watchmen. And the result also suggests that conducting learning activities can lower the probability of becoming poor. So if you done the learning activities, your probability of becoming poor is a bit lower. So it also implies that policy importance, the upgrading skills and also strengthening the vocational trainings. So having outstanding the savings could also help cushion the income reductions and thus preventing falling from the poverty. So that's the second regression analysis. So that was the result of the first regressions, and the second regression analysis are broadly similar to the first questions. So the second regression analysis, so we examine the percentage change in income consumption during the pandemic. So the first regression analysis regarding which characteristic matter most, I say this, those lower educations and unprotected employment status were more adversely affected, and the result are probably similar for these exercises as well. So I just highlight the some of the main points. The chart here in this slide shows that the labor income changes from the first quarter to second quarter in 2022 using the PLFS. The result is standardized. So the bar chart, above zero line indicates the reduction was lower than the average. And if the bar chart is below zero, which means the reduction is higher than the average. So although the analysis, this covers only urban areas only, but the light chart shows that there's more like clearer pictures about the sector-wise impact. So the adverse impact of income was high for contact-intensive sectors, such as hotel and restaurants and other services. So other services including the personal services activities. So real estate was also affected, possibly because of the halt in activity during the pandemic times. So low transactions. So on the other hand, the impact was much milder for like agriculture, utility, public, and then health and social sectors. So the chart here shows the result of the consumption analysis by setting dependent variable as consumption changes from 2019 to 2020. So the result for consumption have a much higher standard error due to the volatile nature of the consumptions across household, but overall their result are broadly in line with the previous analysis, like education and employment status plays an important roles. The regression also suggests that households with outstanding saving can also mitigate the consumption reductions, and even and if the household have borrowing, if the household debt, the consumption reduction seems to be higher, possibly because of the liquidity constraints. Okay, so then we can finally move to the last questions to consider the impact of social assistance schemes. To estimate the potential impact of social assistance, we reconstructed the consumption measure to include the value of food subsidy provided by the public distributional systems. So we assign. Is it good?
Requesting everybody to please mute your systems. Please mute your.
Okay, thank you. Just one more question to go, so bear with me. So to estimate the potential impact of these social assistance schemes, we constructed the consumption measures and then added the food subsidy provided by the PDS, right? And then as a percentage, we assume that the eligibility of the system using the state-wise eligibility and the current monthly incomes. So using the current month's income to assign the eligibility, this means that eligibility is determined perfectly. So this is really clearly big assumptions, as in reality, eligibility is not updated such a frequency. However, we made these assumptions as we do not have the better information to more accurately reflect the process of determining eligibilities. At the same time, these assumptions means that our result is kind of upper bound, of the upper bound in terms of the positive impact of the food subsidy on poverty. And the amount of subsidy per recipient is estimated equations, as you see at the slide at the lower bottom here. So the equation is basically saying the quantities of rice or meat distributed per recipient times the difference between the market and subsidized price. And we also consider the leakage, which is L, and where some certain ratio of subsidy does not reach to the recipient. And based on the previous household surveys, the leakage, this L, was the more than 65 in 2004, but it was improved to 45% in 2011. And as we do not have data after this, we just made the two assumptions as highlighting for scenario 1 and scenario 2 at the bottom of here. So for scenario 1, so leakage is assumed to decline from 45% in 2015 to 14% in early 2020, as in the previous literatures. And for scenario 2, we just assume the leakage is declined 0.2% each month and reached about the 30% at the end of 2021. So, and the estimated per recipient subsidy per month can be, you can see as the chart here. So this is the result of these exercises, of this simulation analysis. So the chart here shows the index of populations who fall under the 1.9 PPP poverty lines for rural and urban areas with and without the subsidies. So before the pandemic, on average, so until the 2019, on average, the food subsidy lowers the number of people below the poverty line by about 25 to 30%. And during the second quarter of 2020, the subsidy reduced the poverty population by about around the 30% in rural areas and by around the 40% in urban areas. The result imply the expansion of the social protection helped to mitigate the impact of the pandemic shocks on poverty. Then we have it comes to the another questions. So if the subsidies were supposed more targeted to the more lower income group, holding the total budget constant, for subsidies is constant, right? So the number of people below the poverty line could reduce even further with the same amount of the money. To examine these questions, we consider the really hypothetical, this is hypothetical, reallocation scenarios. And for this scenario, we just assume that the subsidy were taken from household that falls above the 25th percentiles in urban areas and 37 percentiles in rural areas. And then those saved subsidies were equally redistributed to the household in the bottom 20th income percentiles. So the chart here shows the result, what happened after this redistribution. So this blue line is without subsidies, and with subsidies, the baseline one is this red one, and the redistributional scenario, this hypothetical scenario, is this black line. And the simulation results suggest that the redistribution scenario is effective reducing the poverty during the kind of normal times. However, the impact of poverty is unchanged or even worse in the baseline during the second quarter of 2020. So redistribution scenario is worse or unchanged compared with the baseline scenarios. So our interpretation here is that since the first wave of the pandemic led to a very large decline in incomes and consumption for most households, So if you narrowing the supposed led to some household fallen into the poverty. So this result suggests that it is beneficial to provide the supposed with a broader coverage when faced with large negative shocks. And also, this simulation suggests that as the economy recovers from the pandemic, effort to improve the targeting should continue to enhance the effectiveness of fiscal expenditure, which will be crucial when the fiscal space is limited. So this is the summary of our presentations. So I think we all covered, so it's quite repetitive to to read all those stuff. So maybe let me stop here, and so maybe I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kotera, for a very lucid, neat, and sharply focused presentation, bringing out the methodological issues for us to understand and appreciate the results of the analysis. I'm very excited to see that you have accepted the challenge of using two alternate data sources, having completely different methodology of data collection, sampling frame, and also perhaps the purpose of the survey. But nonetheless, the CPHS, Consumer Pyramid Household Survey data, considering the issues about unrepresentativeness of the data, which has been raised by many scholars, you have brought in the PLFS data, which certainly has slightly higher, definitely higher representativeness as far as the Indian rural and urban areas are concerned. You have brought that in to validate and also cross-check. That is certainly very, very exciting. I just can't stop remembering that Surjit, who is, and I would like to invite him just now, was one of the most vocal voices in the National Statistical Commission, always asking, saying that we need the consumption, expenditure, and employment data, with shorter periodicity. And he was the main force in the Statistical Commission, forcing PLFS to come in, and both of us work together. I'm very happy that PLFS data are being extensively used to understand the employment, unemployment situation and the consumption expenditure situation. I hope that the regular NSS survey of consumption expenditure and employment also comes up, so that we can have much richer database to analyze the situation. May I request Dr. Surjit Bhalla to make his observations now?
Thank you, Amitabh. And thank you for Mr. Kotera, for very, very lucid and clear presentation. I'll make a few brief points, but I'll start off with something I've said in my, including in books, etc., about myself. The first phrase I've described myself is have data, will analyze. And the second dictum or second observation I have about research is that the mark of a good economist is what she does with bad data, not what she does with good data, because all of us can analyze good data. So I have to congratulate you that on both counts, and I'll come to the bad data in a minute, but it is a bold attempt. And it is something that I have also done along with my colleagues. Now, the observations I have are as follows. First, in terms of the results, being pandemic versus non-pandemic, and I've said this on other occasions, and you're not the only person guilty. The IMF is guilty, the World Bank is guilty, etc., and guilty of the following. Name me one place in the world that had a lockdown, and except for Sweden and a couple of other places, every place in the world had a lockdown. The most obvious result is when you have a lockdown, those people whose incomes and or consumption depend most on wages will suffer the most. I don't know what one gets, and I'll come to the data. I don't know what one achieves by looking at what happened during the pandemic in a lockdown. Now, if you analyze Sweden, which did not have a lockdown, that would be very, very interesting as to what happened there. But by definition, you lose your wages. There's no work. So therefore, just once, excuse me, once, I'm the only person here. Sorry about that. So that part, I don't have much empathy for or sympathy for, and I don't think there's much value added to research that looks at pandemic effects on either income distribution or consumption. But you do a lot more than just look at the pandemic. So I will now orient my comments to the other part, which I think is very, very valid. Now, what we have, and I think it's a bold attempt to marry the two data sets. And as Amitabh said, they were meant for very different purposes. And I think you should mention more in detail, which I'm sure you know, about the drawbacks of data sets for the purposes of analysis that you have conducted. Now, the PLFS, I think, is a very, very good data set for labor market behavior, but not very good for income or consumption behavior, because in terms of the consumption, they just have one question. How much did you consume last month? And in an analysis that I've done with some colleagues of mine, that basically the underestimation of consumption, and I'll come to the underestimation of consumption, on average consumption I'm talking about, not within, is somewhere upwards of 20%. So the changes in that, so you're only capturing 80% of what the survey should be capturing. Actually, it's much less. Let me rephrase it. Look, basically, in any analysis of poverty around the world, and of poverty, whether based on consumption or on income, it is very important to assess how much of the consumption as measured by alternate measures, which is the national accounts. Now, increasingly around the world, people are moving towards not using survey data or matching survey data with national accounts data. So in terms of the US does it very systematically. Everybody collects survey data. We know we need survey data in order to assess whatever, though there is, just was observed that in terms of labor market behavior, UK is going to go towards just administrative data, because they find that the young generation is too busy with their mobiles, etc., to pay much attention to what the survey is. But be that as it may, so I think there is we now have around the world, and if you have looked at it, etc., tax data, other data, which I think is a lot more informative about what is happening than survey data. But let me come to the survey data of CMIE, which was meant to measure consumption and does, and they don't do it on one question, they do on several questions. And this survey to national accounts ratio of consumption is the lowest ever observed in Indian history. So it's something like 40%. Whereas in comparison, the 2011, the uniform recall period was 50%, and which is a 20% difference in average consumption. And in the MMRP measure has it at 55%. So there's a huge variation. And just as an example of that variation as to how much a uniform recall period does and a modified mixed recall, which you know, and for purposes of the audience, let me just explain the following. That look, in 2009-10 and 2011-12, the NSS conducted 2 independent surveys. They went to different households, but obviously representative households. And what they found was, in terms of poverty, that if you use the uniform recall period, which is what we incidentally did in 1950. So there is the World Bank that insists on using the uniform recall period, which is every consumption item. You ask, how much did you consume of a car last month? How much did you consume of rice last month? And how much did you consume of salt last month? And how much clothes did you buy last month? So everything is on a 30-day recall period. And the alternate measure is that consumer durables are asked on a 365-day, and the consumer durables are 365, and a large section on perishables are asked on a 7-day. And this has been argued in the mid-90s by a World Bank study itself. So the World Bank, Angus Deaton, etc., all said that we should all move towards a measure where perishables are measured on a much lower recall period. Now, does it make, but the World Bank is the only institution I know, along with the fund, to use the URP period, which is what we did in 1951. Now, does it make much difference? That's the key. So in 2011-12 and in 2009-10, we have 2 independent assessments of how much difference it makes. So just for the audience, and you know that, the results are that according to the World Bank uniform recall period, 23% of the population was absolutely poor in India. According to the correct measure, modified mixed recall period, which is perishables, etc., measured correctly, it was 13%, 1-3. 100 million people were considered to be not poor by just measuring consumption according to what the rest of the world says you should measure consumption. Hello, somebody is there? Okay. Number 1. Now, just to put it in contrast, there is the alternate measure. So this is 100 million people in the same year, same time period, same, if you will, data. Hello? Okay. Now that is. Now, you know that there is a poverty measure, the alternate poverty measure, which is from 215 to 221, where education, etc., are considered. The 135 million people were moved out of poverty in 6 years, 5 years, okay, by that measure. And here you have, by the single most important, 1 year, 100 million, the same. So all I'm trying to emphasize is definitions make a big difference. Correct measurement makes a big difference. I will only take 2 minutes more on the CMI data, which you use, and that very much fits into have data, will analyze. And, the study after study has shown that the CMI data are just not representative. We can keep using it. There are so many other surveys you can use, and you can say I've analyzed them, but really the value added on it is very, and unless you get in the last part, and this is the technical part that and maybe the audience, look, the most important thing in survey measures, one of the most important things in survey measures is a weighting diagram. In other words, it's not a random sample, and therefore you oversample the rich or the urban, and you need to get the correct representative weights to get a population estimate. And the CMI data just flunks that, and the modification proposed by the World Bank authors flunks it threefold over. So by just saying that you're using their method, I don't think helps a lot, because the same household, and it's a panel, the same household changes its weight from one period to another, from 1 year to another, by a factor of 100. So 100 times. I mean, how, somebody has to go look into how is it possible. I know the World Bank has published a paper, they've gone into it detail, etc., but they never answer the fact that the weights could be imaginary. They say they've got it from by looking at other data or whatever, but just go deep dive into the weights for each household. How can a household, I've never seen it, and this is my last comment, I've never seen it in any survey in the world, and I've had the good fortune of looking at several of them, where the weights change by this magnitude. How is it possible? So last point, your income, urban and rural, is it in nominal terms or is it in real terms? If it is in nominal terms, then we know, for example, that in rural Bihar, the price level is about 3/4 of the price level in Kerala. So if you use urban and rural as a classification variable and did not compute the real indices for inequality, I presume you've done that for consumption, but whether you did it for the income inequality as revealed by the PLFS data. That's all. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Surjit, for bringing in the data-related issues, the definitional issues, and also the reference period-related issues into the discussion. I think they're extremely important when we look at poverty reduction and you're using alternate data sources. Certainly, these are the things that need to be brought into sharp focus. And the unrepresentativeness that you talked about of the CMI data on an issue on which John Reyes and Surjit Bhalla agree, I would be very happy. And in fact, both of them have said that there are problems because of sampling urban bias and richer household bias. But in defense, as Shinya already mentioned, Dr. Kotera mentioned, that there are some adjustments that have been made by Shinya Roy and Wilde, looking at the macro data of assets and changing the weights. So, but I am still convinced when I looked at those adjustments, and Dr. Kotera has used the adjusted data, still the problems of comparability remain. But nonetheless, we can take up these issues later. Let me invite Dr. Bhasin. Karan, are you here? And after that, we'll open the floor for discussion. Dr. Karan Bhasin, please.
Can you hear me?
Can you unmute yourself and
Yeah, I have
make yourself
unmuted.
visible? Yes, Karan.
Yeah, so there's something wrong with my webcam. Apologies, so I wouldn't be able to turn it on. But I have a few comments to make, and good evening, everyone. Very interesting presentation, and I must say that I went through this paper when it came out, and of course, it extends this analysis further in several different dimensions. But I just wanted to make a few quick points, which extend what Surjit sir was mentioning. So a specific point that I have is that when you are using distribution of transfers, in particular fiscal policy, it's important to keep in mind that the allocation rule uh, was set using the 2011 data. And what that means is that essentially, you already do know which are the households that are being targeted along the consumption distribution, because the eligibility criteria does not change. Now, what happens in the process is that, and this is what, we, in our paper, we spent a lot of time discussing this issue about India's poverty line being too low. And subsidy as a percentage of poverty line, expands substantially. So when you have a large shock like the pandemic, and you have a lot of people around a particular threshold, the distribution gets fatter around a certain level, and then suddenly you have a substantial increase in subsidy as a ratio of poverty line. What you see is that it does have a redistributive effect, because households who would have gone below poverty line, typically don't do that simply because the subsidy has been expanded. So some of that analysis would, of course, be useful. I know that Alan Gelb and all had some surveys where they found 85% of targeting. Of course, you have different sensitivity assumptions, but it would be interesting to see that aspect being brought in. Another related issue, on lockdowns. Essentially, what is a lockdown? It's basically shutting down markets, which would have some effect on consumption when you want to capture consumption poverty. So there's one effect on wages, because of course employment levels go down, and there's another effect. So even if you have the money, even if you're getting social protection measures, at the end of the day, your consumption is restricted by whatever markets are open, which would of course be essential, goods, agricultural products, some medicine and necessities. And that makes it a bit challenging, in my view, to look at, consumption poverty through lockdown periods, uh, because it's kind of also, a technical issue, right? Because if markets are shut, you can't consume. So how much of your consumption has gone down because you're unable to consume, versus how much of it is gone down simply because, markets are shut? Um, Unfortunately, a lot of attention, hasn't been devoted to that particular area. When people are talking about lockdowns and consumption poverty. So at least some of that, discussion would be useful, particularly during the first wave when the lockdown was the most severe uh, in India. Now to inequality, some of your results on inequality. I do know that you cite the paper by Malani and Gupta, the NBER paper, which uses CMI and finds consumption poverty started to decline post 2017, and that trend continues during the pandemic. If I'm interpreting your results correctly, I suspect you are saying that your results differ slightly. So, why is there a difference in CMI results? Because in our separate work, we find results that are, kind of consistent with what Arpit Gupta et al. Found. And even in the recent Panagaria and Moore paper, they also find something very similar on the inequality aspect. So if you could throw some light on why your results are different, uh, because if you use PLFS, you get a very consistent decline in consumption inequality. Of course, there are all sorts of challenges with using that as a consumption measure, but would be interesting to get a sense of why you're getting a different result on inequality from them. I think these are
Karan,
the
are you-
only points that are.
Okay. Thank you, Karan. Thanks for bringing in these issues. Now, Dr. Kotera, would you like to take this first, or should we open the floor for discussion and take the other questions from the participants, and then we ask the presenter, Dr. Charan Singh? What do you think? Should we open the floor for discussion, or should we request the presenter to respond to these questions?
Generally, because very thick comments have been made, maybe Shinya should have the chance to answer them. I leave it to
And then
you.
we open it up for discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, Shinya, you take 5 to 10 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes rather, so that we can have other participants coming in.
Okay, thank you so
Quickly
much.
respond to this.
Yeah, so thank you so much for all the comments, and I really appreciate all the very useful comments. And I understand this, the data restriction is a really difficult challenges for analyzing the poverty and inequality. So we use this CMIE data as well as the PLFS, as those are because these are available data sources that were during the pandemic time. But at the same time, as we also aware the severe like the restrictions, so both advantage and disadvantages, and then I don't say our analysis is perfect, so that's why we were using data sets as much as possible to capture the changes as much as possible. So maybe I'm just quickly, I'm totally aware of the PLFS, their labor force survey, and they also capture the incomes, but their income data is limited to the labor market, so it doesn't cover all income. So in terms of the coverage, PLF, I'm aware that the PLF income analysis is have limitation as well, and also the consumptions is also the definition. Because we didn't use the consumption data for PLFS, because the data PLF collector say this data is not to to capture the consumption data. So so that's why the PLFS collect the usual monthly consumer expenditure. But this official report mentioned that this monthly consumption expenditure is to collect only to classify the household in different usual monthly consumptions expenditure, and it cannot be used to estimate the household consumer expenditure, which generally estimates based on the detailed studies. So that's based on their official report, this usual monthly consumption expenditure is not like is not recommended measures. So that's why we didn't use the to PLF consumption to measure the inequality and poverty here. So regarding the CMIE data weight adjustment, we are aware that it's also have limitations. It have a limitation in representativeness, and even though we try to adjust this weight as much as possible, we are aware of this might be some limitations. But and it's also, as the Dr. Bhalla kindly cited, there's the weight volatility. Weight is not changing like adjusted weight, have a kind of higher volatility across the household and across the years as well. So and to mitigate the more, to just mentioning, so by making these adjustment, we are trying to make these weight adjustment every month. So we are treating this CPHS data as a cross sections for analyzing the poverty and inequality. So it have as if it has like a new sample of households for every month. And for this kind of disruptive analysis of consumption and inequality analysis, over time, we're just using data as a cross sections, as a node panel. But for the regression analysis, we are using these panel data structures of the database. So the weight volatility in the same household is become a big issue. To mitigate this volatility, we try to use the average of the household average weight during the 2020 average to make this weighting volatility a bit more to be consistent. So, but I'm still, even though we did that, I'm still aware this might be an issue for the weighting strategies also. But again, we don't have any alternative data sources, so this is what would be best we could. And also for income data, so we are just using the we are always separating rural and urban. As I know, there's the urban and rural consumptions, and then the price level, and it's quite very different. So we are everything. We are doing this income and urban separately, even for income and the consumption. So everything is separated. Yeah. Maybe let me. Maybe let me stop here, and then maybe we can open the floor then.
Thank you, Dr. Kotera. We now open the floor for discussion, questions, comments. Please unmute yourself, announce your name, and make comments as briefly as possible. And general observations you can share later on through EGROW Foundation. But if there is any specific comment that you would like to share and get a clarification, you're welcome to do that right now. Dr. Singh, do you have any question in the chat box?
Generally, people have liked the presentation extensively and requested if PowerPoint can be given. And if Shinya, you would agree, the PowerPoint had lots of information we put on the internet and the EGROW website. We'll attach your PowerPoint along with it.
Any hand that you see, any button being pushed?
I don't see any hand. I'm surprised.
In that case, I use
but Surjit Bhalla has a hand now.
Surjit?
Yeah, I know I've spoken before, but given
I'm happy that you are able to stay for the whole discussion. I thought you'll run away for your travel related.
It is
Great.
quite interesting. I have two short queries. That the CMI data set is a panel data set, and therefore the very assumption that the weights of that panel household should change from month to month or quarter to quarter, it needs to be substantiated. Second, you said, if I understood right, that you treat all rural the same and all urban the same, but there are price differences. As I mentioned, we've done that analysis, and in our paper, that there's about a 25% difference within the rural areas between one state and another price level, and the same in urban. So I think you need to, and the data are available. You need to break up by states. There is the state level data available of CPI-AL and the CPI for urban workers, industrial workers, and try and adjust, because I know that's why I brought up that question. I know you didn't mention that this was all real, but I think that does make can make a big difference. It's something to be explored.
Thank you, Surjit, for again bringing in this data-related issue for CMIE. I have generally shared those. Hello?
Yeah.
I have also my skepticism about the CMI data. I have not used it, but nonetheless, I can add another thing, Dr. Kotera. You have mentioned that the response rate in CMI went down by 36% during the COVID period, and they had to go for telephonic data collection. Now, once you do that, the response rate would not go down uniformly across the income categories. So, obviously that will introduce another set of biases. But having said all that, I would tell Surjit that, Shinya starts by saying that I'm not really working out poverty figures from CMI data and working out poverty figure from PLFS data and comparing. No, he says I want to find out the characteristics of the households and the factors which are behind them. What are the factors which are causing it? And if you are analyzing them separately, and if you are getting similar pattern and similar, factors which are behind them, I have a feeling that one can look at the conclusions and compare the conclusions and the results. So that to that extent, I would take the results that have come out. I'm really impressed that there is some kind of a convergence of the overall trends and patterns that are emerging from different sets of data. But I have one or two things that I would like to share with Shinya, just have your comments on that. First, the point that you mentioned about targeting, that I think is extremely important. In India, there is an understanding that if somebody's methodology gives a very high rate of poverty, and the informal sector, Arjun Singh Gupta committee said all poverty is about 70%, and you think, yes, that is the person who has the real concern for the poor. But no, by doing that, you really open up. You talk about universal kind of a thing, and your analysis of targeting the subsidies does show that, targeting helps in poverty reduction much more effectively. So that is something that I would really share my satisfaction with you. But one point that I want to ask you, see, while Surjit has done this adjustment of bringing in the subsidies for food, and you add that in the household's expenditure, and you have done it rightly by taking the offtake and the eligibility at the state level. But there are other engagements of the state which would affect the poverty calculation. For example, gas being made available, electricity subsidies which is being given hugely. So for a long-term methodology for poverty calculation, poverty line should be really, or the household expenditure should be dependent on state engagement. If there is a higher state engagement in food, basic amenities, you have to add all that into consideration. Now, if you're doing that, there's a disengagement of the state also in health and education. The out-of-pocket expenditure for health and education has gone up significantly for the poor households as well. We have the national samples of survey data, which really opens up the whole lot of issues, that you have to make adjustment for the state engagement by recalculating the household expenditure, by taking the subsidies and the withdrawal of subsidies and the withdrawal of the state engagement. That is a larger question that comes to my mind. The final point that I would really take home from your presentation, what your study shows, that just decline in the income in a certain month or 3 months period does not make the household equally vulnerable. The vulnerability of the household depends on its characteristics. You mentioned that your savings rate, you can do dissaving. If you have a loan, then your vulnerability is much higher. That is, I think, a very, very significant point. And I'm mentioning this because there are many people who are very skeptical about multidimensional poverty. This is a multidimensional poverty does not measure poverty. Poverty has to be income or consumption based. Poverty in health and education, for the last 30 years in India, people have been making noise that your poverty calculation is so partial, it is only calculating income poverty. And now that a multidimensional poverty has come up, people want to throw the baby with the bathwater and saying that no, multidimensional poverty is totally useless. It measures deprivation and not poverty, as if poverty, if it doesn't have deprivation, it is an empty box. People like Pranav Sen has said that. Prabhat Patnaik says that, look, access to drinking water, sanitation, and education is not reduction of poverty. It is only modernization. Now, modernization brings in reduction in the deprivation. But what your analysis says, basically, I'm interpreting it in the manner that if a household loses income for 3 months, but has a house available, drinking water available, children are going to school, all the assets are there, the vulnerability will be much less. That household can perhaps, based on all that asset characteristic, can borrow money and survive. So I think that is a very good point that I'm taking home from you, that the vulnerability of a household does not depend only on the consumption or income, because based on other assets and access to health, education, and the other assets, the household can survive and take care of the exigencies. So that is why I think we should not make poverty so fluctuating over time depending on only income, because there are other things which can compensate and bring in additional borrowing capacity and make the household survive. And that is, I think, is a very important take home from your presentation. Is there any other question that we can put to the Shinya? If none, Dr. Sharan Singh?
Yeah,
Yes, I see. Yes, Ashok?
Yes, yes. Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. It was, should I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So it was very stimulating discussion. Two, three points which are just agitating my mind. One is the presenter, he has calculated intra-household poverty, because there are evidences where in the lower state of the income, there is a gender bias, and then some people within the household get the meal, others don't get, or get a less than what is their need. That is one aspect. And on leakage of subsidy, in the presentation it is said that from 45% to 14%. And what is the rationale for this in scenario 1? And in the scenario 2, it is presented that this subsidy can go to about 0.02% per month, which will rise to the about 30%. So what is the rationale behind such an assumption in scenario 1 and scenario 2? And let us be realistic, the people and the government get habituated to give some level of subsidy. Now you were arguing that from the 50% you redistribute the subsidy to the bottom 30%, and then it will be a different scenario. To what extent in a country like India, especially the democratic country, once you make the people habituated to certain level of subsidy, it's very difficult to withdraw from that. So in case you I would like you to react to these issues which are passing through my mind.
Thanks, Ashok. I think you are right that given the mindset of the people, I mean, Shinya is talking about economics and the targeting of the welfare. Whether it is politically feasible or not, given the politics of the country, is something different. Dr. Shinya, you have the time to respond to the.
Thank you. So first of all, our analysis about the statewide, the price differences, and the also state, like, the statewide eligibility. So we also, we didn't much think about these aspects actually. So that's actually, we need to dig in more about the statewide and differentials. So that's other more research. I think we need to do that. And also for internal family, the property internal family, we didn't go much into this one, so I don't know about this inter-family property. And regarding the leakage, our assumption is the 2011 data. It says the leakage is about 45%. So we just take this 45% in 2015, and we assume this will improve because, from 2004 to 2011, this leakage improved. So we assume this trend of improvements of leakage continues. And for this scenario 1, we assume the scenario falls to 14% by early 2020. This is actually based on the, I think, the paper, previous paper. I think the Dr. Bhalla, 2020 to this paper. And then the second scenario, we just assume it's gonna it's more like a optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. And the scenario 2, the reductions for each month is a bit more lower. The reason is not because we just don't have any good information. So we just assume the improvements continue, but in an optimal way or more like less optimal way. So these are just our purely assumptions. So don't have a good reason except for the starting points. Let me
Thank you.
stop here.
So, Dr. Charan Singh?
Yeah, Shinya, my questions are very general, though this is not my area. Listening to you, I feel that quite a bit of work, probably because of data availability, first by Dr. Bhalla, Dr. Virmani and Karan, and now you, have taken into account food subsidy and then try to understand what its impact has been on poverty and reduction in poverty. And your study, in a way, strengthens the argument which Dr. Bhalla, in his paper, had made. My thoughts have been, and even then I was wondering, and even now when you have presented such an extensive work, in India during this period, we may not call it quote unquote health subsidy, but the government of India made sure that health facilities, the vaccines, the hospitals are available to one and all, irrespective of the capacity to pay for it. Now, has there been any attempt in your team to quantify and capture that aspect and then study whether different segments of the society, the urban, the rural, and the different percentiles in each, whether they also benefited from that, and how did they benefit, or to what degree did they benefit? The type of analysis that you have done with food subsidy segmented, that was one. The other is, given the success of the food subsidy program in India, has this been a lesson for IMF to replicate in some other countries and see, or is research already being undertaken in the IMF on some other countries which probably could have experimented or did experiment with similar food subsidy or health subsidy?
So thank you so much for your comment. So our analysis is based on the consumptions and inequality. So all like vaccination is not like a part of the consumption. We do not because this is how we like limitations of the measures. But we just make as long as the consumer is not paying for it, this may not be captured, except for the food subsidy we implicitly included in here. Yeah, because it's kind of hard to identify how much each household can get. It can get these like additional support is a very hard to capture. But that's also another aspect of the multidimensional poverty, right? For if it's like vaccination or health, or how about nutrition, so schooling and other aspects. So that might be captured by a multidimensional poverty rather than like maybe the consumptions or pure consumption or pure incomes. And then as for the the food subsidies, right? I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not aware of the other IMF cases, so sorry, I'm not be able to share any information about the cross countries dimensions about the food subsidies. I'm sorry about that.
May I just intervene here? You see, if you're bringing in health and education, and you look at the National Sample Survey data of the 70s, the bottom 20% hardly paid anything for health and education because it was a public good. And increasingly you find that the expenditure per capita in the poorest household has gone up. So in that sense, although it is true that many of the hospitals have been opened for access to anyone, many of the private hospitals that enjoy massive subsidies from the government for importing the medical equipments and land, they have to reserve 10% of the seats for the poorest. And there is a survey conducted at Jawaharlal Nehru University which showed that the hospitals do not give this 10% to the poorest. They give to their own employees and to unspecified people. So to say that really in hospitals, there is an increase in the subsidy of the government over time, that needs to be established, because the data do show that the poorest of the households are also spending a lot of money, to bottom 20%, out of their own budget, which they were not doing earlier. So adjustment needs to be made for the public engagement, differential public engagement. But how you do that is certainly a methodological issue, right? So if I can conclude, it's been a very useful discussion, and I appreciate the attempt in this IMF working paper in bringing in alternate data sets. Despite the limitations of the data, the purpose was to identify the factors behind it and not to determine the levels of poverty. So that, to that extent, I think it has been successful, because the pattern that emerges are somewhat confirming each other. Well, there are data related issues which is beyond the control of the researcher. Surjit himself, when he did not have the consumption expenditure data, projected the consumption expenditure based on certain assumptions which can be questioned. Similarly, CMI data being adjusted for assets in CMI data being much higher than the average coming from NSS or from they have NFHS data. That adjustment have been made by people, but again, then month to month, the weightage of the household changes. These methodological issues remain, but nonetheless, it's a very useful exercise being done and focusing specifically on the COVID period, monthly variations, first wave to second wave, which gives us some insight again. But there are problems. I entirely agree that consumption data from PLFS is not that robust, because there was one question being asked, but now there are 4 questions, and subsequently the number of questions items have gone up. But still, the average sample, even earlier in the 2009-10, gave lower value of consumption expenditure. But still, Shinya, I must tell you, there are a number of people who are calculating poverty on the basis of the consumption expenditure data, the national and international organizations, because they would say, look, what else do we have? If you want to say something, the only option is that we always ask the government should conduct population census and also the regular NSS surveys urgently and immediately. There doesn't seem to be any reason for really postponing this any further. And I would like to really compliment EGROW Foundation for not only taking the issues which are already in the public domain, where India is doing excellent at the global level, but also identifying some areas of concern, and poverty, inequality, unemployment are areas. And EGROW Foundation has been always very willing to invite opinions which can be critical, which needs to be debated, which needs to be investigated. I would like to really thank Dr. Charan Singh for making this discussion very, very inclusive. Thank you once again, Dr. Charan Singh.
Thank you, Professor Kundu, for agreeing to chair at a 24-hour notice. Actually, it was even less than that. And I knew that it is worrisome, but because you're an expert, and as it's obvious to all of us, that was the right decision we took. Dr. Bhalla had to travel, and the last minute there was a little change, and thanks for accommodating and chairing the session. I want to thank you, Shinya. Beautiful, beautiful presentation. We have been trying to get you to speak on this forum for nearly 6 months, but somehow we were very unsuccessful, and finally we did it together. So thank you for coming finally. I also want to thank Dr. Bhalla and our friend Karan, who agreed to be a discussant, because this paper is more of an extension of their paper. It was very reassuring that using the same different data set, you're reaching the same conclusion. That also almost gives us an assurance that the policy making in our country is robust, that the policy implementation is laser beamed, and To a great extent, we have been successful during this period of holding back. Otherwise, before COVID had really, the fear was that in India, people will slip below the poverty line in millions, and there'll be deaths also. To a great extent, we have been able to save people slipping back into the poverty line. That's why I was wondering whether an extension of this experiment has been done in other countries, now at least, a lesson worth taking. I have two important announcements to make. First one is EGROW Foundation is making an attempt on economic literacy at very nominal rates. Every evening, we run a course from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. on economic issues. These are 5 modules per week, and every week the module changes. But basically, each one of them is very rightly priced or very nominally priced, just keeping or covering the cost. Aim is spreading economic literacy across the country. The speakers are generally retired chief economists or senior economists in the central bank or Indian Economic Service, or who have worked in the profession economics like JNU or Delhi School of Economics or Delhi University. So the aim is financial economic literacy. I would request you to please spread the word and get people to join in and take advantage and benefit of this nominally charging evening course from 7:30 to 8:30, and we cover all types of issues, as you would visit our website and see. The last announcement I would like to make is next week we have Mr. Nalin Mehta, author of a book. It is a book on technology and India's tech aid, just recently been published. You would have seen the book reviews in the newspapers. Professor Nalin Mehta is a professor at Dehradun. So he'll be making a presentation on his book, The India's Tech Aid. I would invite you. The timing will be 4:30 to 5:30. With this, let me once again thank the speaker, speaking from Washington, Professor Kundu, chairing at Bhalla and being the discussants for this paper. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend and see you next week. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much.